Good afternoon, everyone. I'd also like to welcome everyone to the Secure Poultry Supply Plan webinar. Our speaker today is Dr. Carol Cardona. Dr. Cardona is a professor in avian health at the College of Veterinary Medicine at the University of Minnesota. As Pomeroy Endowed Chair in Avian Health since 2010 and an expert in avian flu, Dr. Cardona has done abundant outreach on behalf of the poultry industry, as well as served as a liaison for researchers at the University of Minnesota and industry alike. She and her colleagues at the university continue to develop disease control and continuity of business strategies, including the development of the Secure Poultry Supply Plan. I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Cardona.
Thank you very much. So welcome everyone to what I hope will be an enlightening experience for all of us, and I welcome all of your questions. This is obviously a work in progress for all of us, as all of our work is. So if you are sharing the screen with me, I look forward to continuing to do that. So the Secure Poultry Supply Plan. I'm going to talk about the evolution of the continuity of business plans, what we've learned, what we learned from getting to use the plans for the first time in 2015, the progress that we're making with the Secure Egg, Secure Turkey, and Secure Broiler Supply Plans, and a Secure Poultry Supply Plan that puts the pieces together to make sense of all of it. So, keep calm. This is just the beginning, and this started a long time ago, so bear with me as I walk you through it. The beginning of all of this was an idea, and the idea was that the products from uninfected flocks in a control area could be moved to market without expanding an outbreak. The science of risk assessment could be the basis for determining if and how products could move. And to get the information that was needed for those risk assessments, a partnership between regulators and industry would be essential. Neither party knew enough to be able to accomplish these risk mitigations and risk assessments alone. So with that in mind, the Secure Egg Supply Plan was the first plan that was started, and that started 11 years ago. A working group was formed that consisted of egg sector professionals, state and federal regulators, and academics. They defined the importance of the monitored premises in their work, and they also pioneered strategies to mitigate risk. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about this strategy of the monitored premises and this idea of mitigating risk so that you can understand the basis of these plans. So the new concept that came about was, the old concept was if you get a positive test, and something we all understand, then you know that you have a positive premises. So, for example, if you have 7 million birds on a premises and one bird tests positive, that whole premises is positive. That we all understand that. But to build an idea of what you would have to do to figure out if that premises was mostly not positive, this idea of a monitored premises came along. So in that, we also have the idea of a test. So a test that comes out negative. We then have to build on top of that a flock, an understanding that this premises can't have any epi links to an infected premises. In other words, it can't be a dangerous contact. We have to also say that this premises doesn't have birds that show morbidity or mortality that could be linked to high path AI. And then you also have to have in place biosecurity that is of an acceptable level to state and federal regulators. That monitored premises status that a farm or premises could achieve by jumping through these hoops and achieving these criteria is good for 24 hours. Because in the next 24 hours, you could have a very different outbreak map. So you could wind up getting a positive test. You could suddenly have epi links to a new infected premises. You could have the appearance of clinical signs, or your biosecurity may no longer be acceptable. So you've got to have this renewal of the monitored premises status every 24 hours. So this is the case and the basis for our continuity of business work. So to understand what that means and what we're trying to do here, when you have a monitored premises and a flock or a premises that has flocks that test negative, is not a suspect, not a dangerous contact, and has biosecurity, that premises is going to have a very low load of virus, if any at all. Most likely that premises is negative, uninfected. But there might be some that we would call not known to be infected. And by achieving that monitored premises status, we know that that load of infection, the prevalence of infection on that farm is very low. That's in contrast to when we can detect an infection on a farm or in a flock. Once that farm becomes infected or is known to be infected, there's a considerable amount more virus in the environment, in the birds, on that premises. The continuity of business principles have been designed to work on that monitored premise status, so that very low load of virus, if any at all, more than likely uninfected. So that continuity of business principle was first brought out by the Secure Egg Supply. The other thing that this group did early on was to develop an idea of how to mitigate risk pathways. So the basis of a risk analysis is to identify the risk pathways, the ways that infection could be spread by this movement. So the group came up with this idea that, for a washed and sanitized egg or any egg product, there could be high path AI on the inside of an egg laid by a flock if they're infected. So again, from a monitored premises. If that high path AI was on the inside of an egg, it could be the way that infection could spread from that farm, from that flock on that farm, to a naive population. So we knew that if you test that flock that laid that egg, and then that same day you ship those eggs out, you would have a low risk of moving virus, moving high path AI from that flock to another flock. But if you test the flock for an additional 2 days while holding the eggs laid on day 0, those and the tests are negative, then you move the eggs from day 0 on the second day, the risk goes to negligible. And the reason is that on day 1, you have a greater chance of detecting infection from day 0. On day 2, you have an even greater chance. In other words, the infection would be spreading in that flock, so you would have a better chance of knowing it was infected. So that is how that risk mitigation works. So in creating the SES, the work group worked together to identify risk pathways. They identified them using discussions with experts. They talked about it among themselves, and they did extensive literature review. The idea is to answer the question, how could the outbreak be spread by this movement? The work group then identified ways to mitigate risk, and this is primarily coming from our industry partners. What are your practices, and how could you change those reasonably in an outbreak to reduce the risk of spread, much like that example of holding eggs for 2 days. Those risks then, with mitigations, are modeled, and the risk assessment is written. So in the example of washed and sanitized eggs, those risk pathways are basically 4. High path AI could be on the inside of the egg. And so the mitigation is, as I described, hold the eggs for 2 days while continuing to test the flock. If the flock remains negative, there's negligible risk that those eggs that were laid contain high path AI. High path AI could also be on the packing materials as it's shipped out. Well, you're only allowed to use new pack, so it can't be there. High path AI could be on the outside of an egg, if it's got fecal contamination or small bits of feather. No, these are washed and sanitized. And this points out the need to make sure that each of our risk assessments are applied correctly to the right commodity, because that certainly is a valid pathway for the move of nest run eggs. Finally, high path AI could be on the truck or driver. So that's true, and that's a valid pathway that's not mitigated in our risk assessment. So that is the permit criteria for the movement of washed and sanitized eggs from a premises that has poultry to a market or a premises that doesn't have poultry. So the permit criteria is for truck and driver biosecurity. So if we look again at this diagram, you can see, again, for a positive premises, a single test is what you need to make sure that to say that it's positive. To move washed and sanitized eggs to market, you would have to have a 2x on two 24-hour periods where you're you are a monitored premises. That will achieve your hold time, and then you have to have truck and driver biosecurity. So in order to move washed and sanitized eggs, you have quite a bit of work to do and quite a bit of monitoring. The Secure Egg Supply Plan consists of risk assessments that address commodity movements with those mitigations. They've been modeled and the risk assessments written. The risk that are assigned from negligible up to high, and the products in this the Secure Egg Supply are all egg-based products. And you can see them arrayed against the risk categories. If you're interested in reading those risk assessments or seeing the work, it's available online at the URL listed. You know, in case anybody has it and wants to get over it. The same process was used to develop the Secure Turkey and Secure Broiler Supply Plans as I described for the Secure Egg Supply Plan. A work group was formed with industry, regulators, and we academics sort of serve as moderators and risk assessors. We asked the question, how could the outbreak be spread by this movement? And which movement? We determined that based on the needs of those industries. We then asked the industry people particularly what could be done to reduce risk. And based on those risk pathways and risk mitigations, we write and model the risk assessments. So the Secure Turkey and Secure Broiler Supply Plans, we first did hatching egg movements and day-old bird movements from hatcheries, and we did that also for the Secure Egg Supply Plans. And that is what is online at the Secure Broiler Supply and Secure Turkey Supply URLs. But where the Secure Egg Supply Plan focused on eggs and egg products, those aren't really relevant for the broiler and turkey commodities. So we've had to branch into live bird movements, which is extremely difficult and, you know, requires a kind of a different level of thinking. So these are going to be higher risk movements and are going to require new approaches. So just like the Secure Egg Supply folks came up with innovations around how to mitigate pathways and this idea of monitored premises, we're now looking at live bird movements and how we're going to accomplish the security of those movements. So a new concept, this came out of our turkey working group, is this idea of a pre-movement isolation period, which is a period of extreme biosecurity prior to the movement of birds. This idea is to minimize the chances of a flock being exposed to high-path AI close to the scheduled movement date. This reduces the overall likelihood of moving an infected and undetected flock. So how does it work? Well, you know, most of our ideas are around, you know, how can we best detect or most rapidly detect an infection. And so a lot of the work that we do is based on excellent modeling done by our partners at SIA and also by our own excellent University of Minnesota modeling team. And I'd like to give a shout out to Shashi Malati, who for many years has been, doing all the hard work behind this, and the rest of us just get to take credit for it. So thanks to Shashi, this is, and his team, this is one of the things we see. So if a flock is infected several days before movement, it would likely be detected by the tests that are required to get a permit. So in other words, you would be able to detect as the number of infectious birds increase, you would be able to detect those birds given the pool sizes and the number of tests that are required prior to movement. But if the exposure happens closer to the time of movement, it becomes very difficult. The number of infectious birds doesn't go up very much, and the number of dead doesn't go up hardly at all. So there's not very much infection there, but it's also very difficult to detect, because if there's a long prodromal period, in other words, the birds aren't showing many clinical signs, you can't figure out which birds have the infection. And so if we take the example of 20,000 turkeys, which of those 20,000 need to be tested to detect the 100 that have the infection? So it becomes increasingly difficult to find. So this idea of the pre-movement isolation period was brought up in order to address that or to mitigate that risk. And what it does is the PMIP starts, so in order to prevent exposure that would occur close to movement. So we block out the opportunity for exposure during that period of time. And why is the PMIP, how is the length of that PMIP determined? Well, it's determined, much of it in partnership with our friends at Southeast Poultry Research Lab, who, for example, give us numbers around mean death times. How quickly could a poultry farmer detect, find dead birds that rise above the level of expected mortality? So how long after exposure can you detect infection? And that's going to be the factor that determines our PMIP. So if we go back to our original pile of things to do, you can see that it continues to get bigger and bigger. And, again, for a positive, we have a single test. For moving live birds, which is a much more dangerous movement than moving washed and sanitized eggs from a control area, you have to have 8 days of monitored premises for 24 hours each. You're going to have this pre-movement isolation period, which means no non-essential visitors, no garbage pickup, no off-site manure, litter, or mortality movement, no bird movements, and enhanced personnel biosecurity. You're also going to have, right before the movement, you're going to have truck and driver biosecurity to do during the movement. You're going to have loadout biosecurity, live haul biosecurity, and you're going to have to determine a route that does not go near any other poultry premises. So establishing the negative case and establishing that you're not going to spread disease along with the movement of product is a very, very labor-intensive situation. So then we got to use these plans. And I think most of you are aware that, we had a very large incident in the Midwest and in the West. The largest foreign animal disease outbreak in U.S. history ended towards the end of June in 2015. During that outbreak, as it relates to this continuity of business plans, we learned several things. We learned that for each and every positive case, there are going to be many, many non-case premises that will want or need to move product. That effort is going to require workforce and infrastructure. And I think you can see from those piles that we've created just how incredible that workload can be. We found out that, the guidance and permits that we had written from our ivory tower perspective were too detailed for regulators to use as is. and we had created different types of permit guidance for similar and different products, which resulted in confusion between different commodities. So the idea to fix this was to create a secure poultry supply plan. This plan is supposed to facilitate poultry industry and state regulatory agency preparedness for product movement in a high path AI outbreak. So the idea was to create a harmonized approach to permitted movement, where we link the science of the secure egg, broiler, and turkey supply plans to permitted movements in an outbreak. So, as you know, science is the language that we've used in these risk assessments. And the reason is that the movement of product from a control area into a region with a dense poultry population is scary. It's scary for, the guy who's invested his life savings in that broiler flock, and it's scary for the company whose systems, spread throughout a state or throughout a region. And it's scary for regulators who don't want to see this spread. It's scary for everybody. The risk assessments of the continuity of business plans provide a way to understand that risk, even if you're not familiar with the specific activity. So the risk assessments give a rating from negligible to high, and that rating should help to allow different industries and regulators to understand what those risks might be. So for example, how would a broiler company understand the risk to them of an egg production farm moving washed and sanitized eggs? Well, that's going to be, as I described, a negligible risk movement. So if you said, we're going to move something from an egg production farm into a broiler dense area, you might freak out a little bit. But if we said, we're going to move a negligible risk product, this is specifically how it's going to be done, the transparency and the risk rating help to help people to understand what's actually going on. So the science is still there, and that comes from our STS, SES, and SBS plans. The SPS, the Secure Poultry Supply Plan, is built on that science. The science of the risk assessments are the basis for the permit guidance in the SPS. So that permit guidance is boiled down from those hundreds of pages that are risk assessments. The permit guidance is then the operational part of a risk assessment. So, question, what do I need to do to mitigate risk when moving washed and sanitized eggs from a monitored premises? Answer, look in the Secure Poultry Supply permit guidance for that product. And again, those permit guidances are not a la carte. You have to apply the whole thing in order to get to that status that we've modeled. The next step of the Secure Poultry Supply was to create a permitting process that balances the work required for permitting between the industry and the state, and a standardized process in EMERS for getting a permit and communicating with other states that may be involved. So this document shows the EMERS process, the steps of getting a permit request. And what we're talking about today is really the things that are happening upstream of that permit request and what would be referred to if you wanted to question or ask how were these criteria met. So this idea of a monitored premises, so biosecurity, not a suspect premises, not a dangerous contact, negative PCR test, has to be met. Then the permit criteria has to be met. So you know that that permit criteria for washed and sanitized eggs would be 2 days of hold time, testing every day, and truck and driver biosecurity. Those things, this monitored premises status and this meet the permit criteria, is where here in Minnesota we have worked on establishing that with our state. So the poultry industry and the state have worked together to create a more streamlined approach that is now and we've tried to learn the lessons from here. So one of the things was to take those two things and create permits that rebalance effort between industry and state. One of the things that happened during our outbreak, our overwhelming outbreak here in Minnesota, was that the state had to take on too many details of movements that were hard to understand. So the solution has been to ask industry to certify compliance with specific permit guidance specific for that commodity and product. For example, the reason is there's not enough people with the type of knowledge specifically needed to understand the details of a permit. What is a hatching egg versus what is a washed and sanitized egg? There's differences between those two products that affect their risk of movement. There are plenty of people in industry with this type of expertise. So what we've come up with is something slightly different. And the idea is that the state will receive a request that says the requester has certified completion of the steps. The state will add and verify test results and issue permit or not issue the permit based on those test results, the certification, the monitor premises status, and following a situational assessment. The details then of the process fall to industry. The state receives certification and can audit at any time. So the solution, industry has to assure that all criteria are met. They have to be able to know the details of the engine that operates a farm. The state has to see, or the regulators have to see, that appropriate assurances have been met. In other words, they have to be able to drive the car. So in my world, I definitely can drive my car. I definitely cannot rebuild the engine, and I don't have that kind of specific knowledge. And so we think that this is a reasonable approach to help rebalance that effort. Finally, we've worked hard with a number of partners to harmonize movement criteria where possible. So harmonization became a problem just through the process of how these risk assessments were written. They were written by several work groups that operated independent of each other. And those different work groups had different approaches to developing the criteria needed for movement. In the end, though, so what we've done is we've changed the risk assessments, and we've found the places that are the same and tried to harmonize those things so that each of the risk assessments and the permit guidances look more similar. But in the end, only some things can be harmonized, and some things are actually biologically different. So the harmonization is not going to be, the plans are not identical, and they never will be, but they are much more harmonized. So we've harmonized the traceability definitions in each of the plans. The monitored premises definition is now the same. The permit movement guidelines are continuing to be harmonized for hatching eggs, day-old poults and chicks, and birds to market. Sampling protocols are being harmonized, and PMIP discussions are ongoing. So to conclude this, the big idea was that we could predetermine ways that product could be moved during an outbreak, and it did work. The SES, SBS, and STS plans are addressing additional movements through the work group and risk assessment process, both as independent work groups, and now we're going to introduce a cross-commodity work group between members of those three industries to help them discuss high and moderate risk movements. The plans weren't operation ready, so after the hiccups of 2015, we've developed a more harmonized, more straightforward approach that will be more manageable for states and federal regulators in an outbreak. Industry and regulatory agencies needed to rebalance their efforts in permitted movements, and so we think that that's happened. And the How to Move Product Plan is now called the Secure Poultry Supply Plan, and is a welcome addition to the Secure Egg, Broiler, and Turkey Supply Plan. So I'd like to end this with a pitch before I answer questions, but we're always looking for new work group participants, so if you're interested, please let us know. And we do a little orientation for people so that you can understand the continuity of business principles. But if you've been on this webinar, I suppose you have that already. So thank you. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Ladies and gentlemen, as we move to Q&A, please feel free to place yourself into the question queue by pressing #2, that's #2 on your telephone keypad. Voice over computer users, you can select the raised hand emoticon from the top toolbar. You will hear a notification when your line has been unmuted. You can also send in written questions by selecting the participants menu at the top of your screen and opting to send note to all presenters. If you're logged in using the web-based application, please use the Notes tab on the bottom right-hand side of your screen and address your note to all moderators. We did have a written question that was submitted a little bit earlier asking, how is, in quotations, near a poultry premises defined in the context of determining movement routes for live birds? What data is this based on?
That's a really good question. We do have a little bit of data that will be based on, but that's not, I'm going to tell you, I don't think that's a completed risk-based guidance at this point.
Okay, we do have another question. PMI period, what about contact with wild birds? Ventilation allows access. How is this addressed in the RA?
So the risk assessment, the wild bird route of introduction is sort of a constant. The PMIP period addresses personnel biosecurity. So that's one way that wild bird access is prevented. The biosecurity in the monitored premises status should include wild bird proofing and limitation of access to wild birds. So this is the line of separation idea that's out there. So it's included in the monitored premises piece, and also the increased personnel biosecurity in the PMIP addresses that question. Ventilation allows access. So the ventilation as you know, the ideas of airborne transmission were not borne out in this particular outbreak that we had, and so ventilation access, the birds are ventilated during a PMIP period. The more important parts of line of separation are personnel, equipment, and those are all addressed in the PMIP period.
Okay, we have another question that was submitted asking, have these risk mitigating parameters been analyzed for low path AI?
Have these
risk mitigating parameters been analyzed for
low path AI?
Yeah.
So the low path AI question is, many of the risk assessment work is based on low path AI, or some of it is based on low path AI ideas, but mostly, it is quite different. High path AI and low path AI transmission detection, the infected but undetected state, those are very, very different. So the low path AI infected but undetected state is common, where the high path AI is it's more easy to detect if you take these mitigation strategies. So I'm going to say apples and oranges on that one.
Okay, we have another question asking, did the risk assessments fail during the Minnesota outbreak and resulted in additional positive premises due to the movement of birds?
So first of all, at the time of the Minnesota outbreak, we didn't have risk assessments in place for the movement of birds. Second of all, to our understanding, there's no evidence that anything that the outbreak was moved during by the issuance of permits during the outbreak. So I guess my answer is no. They did not fail.
Okay, we have another question asking, can you elaborate on the data that will be used in the risk assessment of moving product near in quotation marks, other poultry premises?
I think I answered that one, right? So we have some data on near poultry premises, but I can elaborate that. The transmission events that we know about are low path AI, so there's an example of how it would be based on a low path AI transmission event. I can answer that more maybe later privately. I can show you some of the data.
Okay, we have another question asking, for permit approval, why are the pass-through states not included in front of steps 5 and 6?
So the pass-through states this is talking about the EMERS process, I believe, and the reason is that the product would be in an enclosed transport vehicle, and so the truck and driver biosecurity should mitigate the risk between those states. So the pass-through states have limited or no risk from that movement. If we go back to where our risk assessments and product movements have been done, they're based on negligible to low risk products. The question, I think may be referring to future movements of things that can't be in enclosed vehicles, like live birds, and I think that's a very different type of question. So it would definitely have to be a consideration there, because lots of things do come off of trucks as you move them, as you move live birds. So good question. Probably two different categories of things. So the pass-through states are not considered because the presumption is that the material is in an enclosed conveyance, but the pass-through states are important if we're talking live birds.
And again, as a quick reminder, if you'd like to ask a question over the phone lines, you can simply press pound 2 on your telephone keypad. If you're using voice over computer, you can click the raised hand emoticon in your top toolbar. And at this time, we do not have any additional questions that have been submitted, and there are no people waiting to ask questions over the phone lines.
Okay. Well, thanks, everybody, for joining the webinar. And watch your emails. We're going to have another webinar in October on the Secure Milk Supply Plan. So thank you, everyone, and thank you, Dr. Cardona.
Thank you all.
Have a great day.